Before and after. The first thing I'm going to do is measure out the width that I need, which is 129 inches from middle to middle on each pole. I want this trellis to be centered in the garden bed, so I'm going to take the length of the garden bed minus the 129 inches for the trellis and then divide that by 2. That will give me the distance that I need to measure in to place each pole. And for the width, I'm going to measure 8 inches in from the sides and then cut accordingly at the end. I'll link all the tools I'm using for this project down in the video description. I'm using a post pounder for this, but you could just use a hammer, I suppose. It would just make the job a lot harder. And these little pole levelers are less than $7, I believe. But you could make your own with some tape and a normal level. You can get all the supplies at your local Home Depot or Lowe's, but I would suggest checking out your local farm supply store if you have one. That's where I got these from, and they were about half the price that the big box stores were charging. This entire project, materials and all, cost me around $100. It's pretty cheap because all these supplies are mass produced to make chain link fencing with. I could have built this trellis out of wood, but this galvanized steel is going to last decades and not just years. I found the easiest way to put on these brace brackets was to pull them apart with your hands, put them on the pole, and then use pliers to crimp them back to their original position. And I forgot to mention, before I pounded these poles into the ground, I did measure 24 inches up from the bottom and made a mark with a marker. This gave me a visual cue of when I needed to stop pounding. With each of these poles being 8 feet long, this will give me a 6-foot trellis after they're pounded into the ground a couple feet. You could use just a regular crescent wrench to tighten these bolts down, but if you have a socket set, it's going to make the job go a lot quicker and easier. You want to tighten these down pretty snug, but make sure you don't over tighten them, as the bolts do strip out pretty easy. And before you tighten it down all the way, make sure that you have your end rail cap centered up nice and straight. On the uncut end, I did take an end cap and measure in the depth that the pole should be in there, just so that I know before I drill it later that the pole is deep inside of the cap. After inserting the side of the end rail into that side, I'm going to bring it over to the other side and then just make a mark where I need to make the cut to make it the right length. Depending on what tools you have available, cutting this end rail can be done in several different ways. I'm going to show you 3 of those ways. The first way is with a cutting wheel. This is the fastest way, but it does throw a lot of sparks and you don't get the cleanest cut this way. The next way is just with a regular hand saw, and this is by far the most labor intensive way. It took me quite a long time to cut all the way through this. The third way was using this tool that I got off of Amazon, and I'll leave a affiliate link down in the video description if you want to get one of these for yourself. It didn't take that much longer to cut it than the cutting wheel did, and it left a lot smoother surface after the cut was made. The vertical poles that I used in this project were 1 5/8 diameter. You could go larger if you wanted to, but I felt that that was strong enough for this project, and they were a little bit cheaper than the larger ones. And this top rail piece is 1 3/8. Unfortunately, even if your garden bed's long enough like mine is, you still have to make a cut on these top rails because they are designed with a tapered end so that they can fit inside each other, because they're made for fencing and they just run really long stretches of them. And that tapered end is not going to fit snug into the end caps that are attached to the end brace brackets. Later, I'm going to put a screw through the end cap into the top rail to hold it in place and make sure that it doesn't fall. But before I do that, I'm going to make sure everything is nice and leveled out. Of course, you could just use 2 poles and a top rail and call it a done job. This would still serve the purpose as a trellis, but as you can see, it's a little bit more flimsy this way. So by doing 2 and then using side bars to kind of pull everything together, you're going to create a lot more strength in this. To be honest, I didn't know how this project was going to turn out and how sturdy it would be, but I am actually pretty impressed of how sturdy it is, given the fact that these posts are only pounded 2 feet into the ground into pretty loose soil in my raised garden beds. Once everything's set in place and you're happy with the way that it looks, take a drill and a drill bit and then drill some pilot holes up through those end caps and into the top rails so that we can later drive a screw through this hole. You don't really have to cut these end rails perfect. You have about 1.5 inches of wiggle room, but if they're too long, it's gonna press your poles out, and if they're too short, you're not gonna have enough depth into those end caps to really hold them tightly. After you put on the side top rails, it's really going to hold this thing together and make it a lot more sturdy. That's why I do recommend doing 2 if you can. If you're not going to do 2, then you just maybe want to pound your poles a little deeper into the ground or get a larger diameter pole. But for these side pieces, I just basically put another couple end brackets and end caps on down below the top pieces, as you can see. And then from there, I was able just to measure the perfect distance across, make those cuts, and then repeat the process where I make my pilot holes, fit them in, and drill them together, or screw them together. Once you have everything snugged up and all the bolts are tightened and you make sure you have a screw through each end of each top rail, there's quite a few things you can do with this framework. One thing you could do that I am not doing here would be to get some kind of material like the hog panels you can get. You can get those for like $30 for 20 feet, I believe, at most farm supply stores. And that's a great material to let your plants climb up. But the way that I'm going to do it on this one, I'm just going to run strings from the top, and then there's these little clips for my tomatoes that I get from Amazon. I'll also list that product link in the description if you want to check those out. They work really well. Each indeterminate tomato that I grow maybe takes 4 or 5 of those clips in its whole lifespan to really secure it to one string, and it's really easy to clean up at the end of the year too. You just cut down the string basically and then save the clips for the next year. I am not a fan of the traditional tomato cages. Most of them are so flimsy, and I like the string method a lot better, especially for indeterminate tomatoes. For determinate tomatoes, maybe the cages are the best option, but for indeterminates, they get so tall that it's hard to get a cage that will be tall enough for them, and it just makes a lot of extra bulk and things to store at the end of the year, where with the string you just have to cut it down and then you can save those little clips for the following year.